Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for our event, AI Races to the Bottom, Consequences of Competitive AI Development Across Industries, brought to you by the AI Security Initiative at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. My name is Rachel Wesson, and I am the Events and Communications Specialist at CLTC. So today we're going to have a panel of 3 AI policy experts, Will Hunt, Tim Huang, and Elsa Kanya, each of whom will give about a 10-minute presentation on their specific research. It is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's panel, CLTC Executive Director Anne Cleveland. Anne, good morning, over to you.
Good morning, hi everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and really warm welcome to Will, Tim, and Elsa. I'm going to introduce the AI Security Initiative at CLTC, but as I'm doing that, I want to quickly acknowledge Jessica Newman, who leads the AI Security Initiative at CLTC. I'm going to do my best to fill her very big shoes this morning while she's out of office, but she is really the driving force behind this work and the person who brings these kinds of conversations together. So the AI Security Initiative is housed here at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. It's a growing hub for interdisciplinary research on the global security impacts of artificial intelligence. We work across technical, institutional, and policy domains to support trustworthy development of AI systems today and into the future. Our research agenda focuses on 3 core issues. The first is vulnerabilities, which considers how reliability, robustness, and transparency affect AI implementation. The second one is misuse, which considers how AI technologies might cause intentional and unintentional harm. And the third is power, which considers how global power dynamics are shifting as different entities vie for AI leadership around the world. So we're delighted to have 3 experts on all of these elements today to discuss each of their work on the competitive dynamics of AI development and how that impacts issues like safety, security, surveillance, and other aspects of AI governance. So as Rachel said, we're going to hear 3 presentations and then we'll get to the Q&A. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker today, Will Hunt. Will is a research analyst at the Will is a research analyst at CSET, Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, focusing on semiconductor workforce and supply chain issues. Previously, Will conducted research on AI policy at the University of Oxford and here at the AI Security Initiative at CLTC. And in fact, the work that Will is going to share today was conducted while he was at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. Will has co-authored commentary on technology policy in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, and he's completing his PhD in political science at Berkeley, where his research focuses on US-China technology competition. So without further ado, Will, please take it away.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Anne. I'm really happy to be here and be part of this conversation. And thank you also to Rachel. I know that you have put a lot of time into conceptualizing and organizing this, so thanks very much. And also thanks to the AI Security Initiative and to CLTC. As Anne noted, I've recently switched coasts to start a new job at CSET, but the research that I'll be presenting today was conducted while I was at CLTC earlier this year. And I'm really grateful to CLTC for supporting that research, though of course any views I express today are my own and not those of CLTC or my current employer. Finally, thank you to Jess Newman, my former boss at CLTC, who unfortunately couldn't make it today for the very good reason that her son Ellis was born just a couple weeks ago. Hope I'm allowed to say that. So hello to Ellis, wherever you are. So there are really good reasons to be worried about AI races to the bottom. And I thought I would start with one that I find particularly concerning. It's especially difficult, as some of you may know, to certify that an AI system is safe before implementing it or before rolling it out in the real world. So with traditional software, you can test the entire range of possible outputs and figure out whether a system is safe in advance of deployment. And that's very difficult to do with AI systems, especially deep learning systems. So there's this difficulty of certifying in advance, and there's also the fact that the costs of failing to bring AI capabilities to market quickly are really high. We all know that this is a very fast-moving industry. So you have this combination of, on the one hand, a fast-moving market, and on the other hand, basically an impossibility of ascertaining in advance whether a given application is fail-safe. So that's kind of a concerning recipe. My goal with the research that I did at the AI Security Initiative was to sort of work toward a theory of when and why AI races to the bottom in terms of safety might be more severe in some domains than others. And I took a fairly empirical rather than theoretical approach. So that there's this notion of AI races to the bottom that companies or countries might sort of compromise on, say, safety in order to deploy things more quickly. But there's been very little work done to systematically assess the empirical evidence of these kinds of races in specific application domains. That's totally understandable given how new the field is, but it's also a little bit problematic because it turns out that when people have examined other issue areas in the academic literature, such as environmental standards or labor standards, they've often found a pretty wide range of competitive dynamics that you might not have predicted if you went in with this sort of race to the bottom narrative in your head. So sometimes there are races to the top, sometimes there are races to the middle, sometimes you have multiple races going on at once in the same industry to the top and bottom. So it would have been hard to predict those kinds of dynamics based on theory alone. And you kind of have to get into the empirical evidence in order to figure out where racing to the bottom is more or less likely and where it might do most harm. So that's what I wanted to do with this project, or at least make a start on with this project in the AI case. For this project, I focus specifically on commercial aviation, and that's for a couple main reasons. First of all, aviation has a long history of automation. So if you rank all the jobs in ONET by how heavily automated they've been over the last couple decades, the jobs like air traffic controller and pilot are in the top 10 most automated jobs. And another reason, in addition to this sort of penchant for automation, is that flying is really safe, and safety is sort of at a premium in the commercial aviation industry. We all sort of know this, but just to give a stat, you have a 1 in 30 million chance approximately of dying in an accident when you board a commercial aircraft in the United States. So in short, aviation has this combination of friendliness to automation and safety consciousness that I think makes it an interesting test case for the AI race to the bottom narrative. To look for signs in the aviation industry of a race to the bottom, I relied pretty heavily on expert interviews. So I tried to talk with a really wide range of stakeholders, including regulators, academics, safety engineers, AI developers at startups serving the aviation industry, as well as people serving on the bodies that are currently setting standards for AI in aviation. And the basic result that I got, I mean, almost everyone was unanimous in this view, somewhat to my surprise, is that the aviation industry is moving extremely slowly and cautiously in adopting AI, at least in safety critical contexts. I actually couldn't find a single case where AI was being used for a properly safety critical function. There are cases of AI being used for predictive maintenance or decision support, but when it comes to flight control or other applications that could actually bring down a plane if they failed, those applications, as far as I know, essentially don't exist. And overall, my assessment was that, if anything, aviation has more of a race to the top dynamic going on with AI rather than a race to the bottom, sort of ratcheting up the safety level over time rather than reducing it due to competition. I want to be clear that the lack of a race to the bottom isn't because of some mystical thing about commercial aviation that allows them to be, especially safety conscious. It really is it's a profit motive question. So it's maybe helpful to consider the case of the MAX 737 crashes in late 2018 and early 2019. One of the results of the investigations into those crashes is that Boeing executives were pushing their employees very hard to accelerate the certification processes for the MAX. And engineers basically described Boeing as a pressure cooker in the lead up to rolling out the MAX. And one reason that ultimately the crashes happened was the failure of an MCAS system, what was called an MCAS system, which was a piece of flight control software, which went through a major change, which was not flagged as a major change by Boeing, probably because that change would have slowed down the certification process. So you can see how clearly it's not the case that aviation firms don't care about beating the competition or moving quickly. The difference in the case of aviation, as far as I can tell, is that when you push too hard or compromise too much on safety, you take a very serious hit to your bottom line. So in the case of the MAX, regulators, including the FAA, grounded all MAX 737s for a year and a half. They're still grounded today, and Boeing has lost about $18 billion because of those crashes. That's not going to happen in every industry, that kind of robust response from a regulator. I think it happens in aviation largely because there's a huge public response to airline accidents, and there's a lot of political will favoring very heavy safety regulations. So regulators like FAA are empowered to ground planes for as long as they would like, and they also are very closely coordinated with other countries and regulators in those countries like EASA in Europe. And these regulators together sort of cooperate to steadily raise the safety standards of the industry over time. So when a new thing like AI comes along, the response of the aviation industry has been so far, how can we use this to make aviation even safer? How can we ensure that this is going to be safe before we roll it out? One implication of this finding that I had of a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom in aviation is that it's arguably a lack of regulations that's slowing down uptake of AI in the aviation industry. So that might be a little counterintuitive. We often think of regulations as slowing down aviation, but in the case of slowing down innovation, but in the case of the aviation industry, firms need much more confidence that the AI systems they develop will actually be certifiable as safe by regulators. So in aviation, we might see more innovation if there were more progress in terms of setting up standards and regulations governing safety, specifically for AI. In terms of other implications for other industries, I don't think that the relevant takeaway here should be that AI races to the bottom are necessarily unlikely or overblown. I'm excited to hear thoughts on this from my co-panelists. But my perspective is that there's probably a very real risk of races to the bottom in some domains, and then much less in others, including aviation. So there will probably be many different races going on in different domains, but it's worth actually studying each of these domains and understanding what's going on so we can get a picture of where the biggest risks might be and what the appropriate policy responses are. I'm looking forward to discussing that idea further with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. Super interesting. And I'm starting to see some questions in the Q&A, which is great. And to the audience, please feel free to continue to submit questions as our panelists share their work. I'm delighted to present our next panelist, Elsa Kania. She is an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Her research focuses on Chinese military strategy, defense innovation, and emerging technologies. At CNAS, Ms. Kania has contributed to the Artificial Intelligence and Global Security Initiative and the Department of Government. Elsa, over to you.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be joining this conversation, and it is a really critical discussion. And while I am hardly an AI security expert myself, I do regard and think about these issues through the lens of someone who has studied the state of play of emerging technological development in China, and also specializes in the intersection of technology and national security. So I'll be shifting the level of analysis from looking at particular industries to thinking about some of the geopolitical dynamics that may come into play, especially as we see the notion or narrative of a race, even or worse, an arms race in AI become so prominent in some of the reporting and conversations out there. And certainly, I'll start off by saying I don't think race is the best way to frame the dynamics we're seeing play out globally in artificial intelligence today. Certainly, there is intense rivalry, including in the domain of military affairs, and certainly we've seen the US and Chinese governments similarly emphasize the importance of leadership in artificial intelligence and aiming to establish prominent positions in this field, but at the same time, clearly the reality is also one of a field of research that is very open and collaborative, as evidenced by the sizable amount of co-authorship that has continued despite some of the frictions geopolitically. And I think we can expect going forward to see the complex coincidence of these trends and factors to continue, or as a number of Chinese policymakers and even military strategists have often characterized it, we're seeing AI be a double-edged sword as it develops, given the risks and benefits that may come into play. And although there have been hyperbolic and not entirely groundless discussions that we're seeing a new round of arms racing, I think the notion of a race to the bottom is hardly inevitable, and hopefully there are opportunities to avert that and to ensure that competition as it continues can mitigate some of the worst case scenarios or consequences that may arise. And certainly as someone who has focused on the Chinese military and its approach to innovation, we've seen enormous enthusiasm for the notion of a revolution in military affairs, an enthusiasm that is sometimes perhaps excessively exuberant and driven also by a fear of falling behind and a notion that AI is truly disruptive and transformational. Plenty of buzzwords that often arise in a US context as well, and often, of course, coming from those without much of a technical grounding or proficiency in the actual challenges of implementing these technologies. If we look at the state of play in US-China rivalry, especially when it comes to the US and Chinese militaries today, there is a tendency to see each other as through a glass darkly, so to speak, with relatively exaggerated evaluations or expectations as to each other's capabilities, each fearing falling behind and fearing that the other may be ahead already. And arguably, instead of an AI arms race, these anxieties reflect what is more of an AI security dilemma, I would say, in the sense both that we are seeing a typical and very classical security dilemma play out between the US and China on some fronts, where measures that each takes in seeking to enhance its own security are regarded as threatening by the other. And at the same time, AI tends to exacerbate this in particular because of the very uncertainty that arises when we are talking about technologies that are qualitative and enabling. AI is very frequently characterized as a much more general purpose technology. So the metaphor of an arms race in many respects is inappropriate, given we're not talking about a single weapon system, but rather something that will have near-term and long-term implications across a range of military applications, including in much more supporting functionalities, such as logistics and general management, as well as intelligence, of course, and that there are reasons for concern that military rivalry could drive risky behavior, but there is a great deal of agency and some reasons to be encouraged on this front as well. So for instance, we On the as to the negative elements of this, we have seen a sense of pressure or intention on the part of the Chinese military, for instance, to be testing and demonstrating these capabilities with the objective of showcasing its innovation and in some respects its status and the prestige of these capabilities as it seeks to present itself on the world stage as a world-class military. Just within the past week or so, there's even been a demonstration of a swarm of suicide drones that were tested by an element of the Chinese defense industry. The question then arises whether some of these emerging capabilities could be deployed in the near future, and if so, what standard of rigor and testing would be deemed good enough at that point. And similarly, when Chinese military researchers and strategists look at the state of play of US developments, they are similarly concerned that the US may gain advantage or may be progressing quite quickly towards the deployment of relatively nascent capabilities. I think generally speaking, when we are talking about military organizations and the culture and practices of professional militaries, there are some reasons to be encouraged that there has been a tendency and a tradition of testing weapon systems, of having relatively extensive demonstrations and experimentations prior to actual deployment. Seen this in the US military more openly discussed in a manner that is transparent and that I think is quite productive. There's been less transparency so far in terms of how the Chinese military has discussed these trends and practices, but also at the same time, reasons to be encouraged that the PLA does have a history and established institutions and expertise in testing in its own right. And going forward, I think in many cases, militaries and national security enterprises will be themselves trying to keep up and keep pace with what best practices are coming from industry and academia. So we can look to, for instance, the robust conversation on AI security that's been underway and undertaken by Chinese policymakers as manifesting in a fairly detailed white paper released on the topic, as well as research and new platforms developed by players in the space like Baidu, Alibaba, startup out of Tsinghua University, Qihoo 360, a cybersecurity company, among others. And there is, as China starts to move towards more of a robust framework for AI policy across the board, attention to the security and controllability of AI technologies, a term of art that often arises, for instance, in Chinese discussions of cybersecurity and concern with ensuring that AI will be reliable going forward. And I think the fact that despite any concerns or aspersions to the contrary, these conversations on AI safety and security are quite active within China should be encouraging in general. And yet at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that the way that norms and practices for AI security may develop in a policy context could differ across countries, of course, as well as across industries. And there are aspects of how the Chinese government and the party state in particular will regard AI security that may be distinct, including, for instance, concerns about political security, risks to societal or social stability, as well as ideological considerations, including the role that AI can play in censorship and public security in ways that can enhance the coercive apparatus of the state. So there appears to be, based on some of the initial policy publications, a fairly expansive conceptualization of what AI security means in China in general. And as we look at these trends going forward across the US and China, across different epistemic communities, I think there are absolutely reasons to think as well forward as to how there can be more of an integrated conversation. It's been encouraging that there have been some dialogues between US and Chinese experts on these topics. Hopefully those can continue and be sustained going forward, whether among technical experts or even among military scientists and practitioners. And I think this is a productive direction for debate and conversation going forward as we think about options for confidence building measures and risk mitigation. So I guess in closing, I don't think we are In an AI arms race, I don't think a race to the bottom is inevitable, either in general or in the military domain in particular, and I hope that there are ways to create some pragmatic parameters and more positive incentives for this rivalry in ways that could lead to dynamics more akin to a race to the top, where there is a premium placed upon security, reliability, and resilience going forward. I thank you, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and to your questions as we continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Elsa. Really interesting, and I'm encouraged that you're encouraged. So our third speaker is Tim Huang. He is also a research fellow at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET. He's the former director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance of AI Initiative, a philanthropic project working to ensure that machine learning and autonomous technologies are researched, developed, and deployed in the public interest. Previously, Tim was at Google, where he was the company's global public policy lead on artificial intelligence, leading outreach to government and civil society on issues surrounding the social impact of the technology. Dubbed the busiest man on the internet by Forbes magazine, his current research focuses on the geopolitical aspects of computational power and machine learning hardware, and the future of media manipulation and online information warfare. Certainly all very relevant topics. Tim, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Anne. So very excited to have the chance to talk to you all today. And I think in some ways my remarks will pick up very much on where Elsa left off. And what I want to do, I think, especially being the last panelist, is to really pick up on the phrase, the theme of the event, right, which is races to the bottom. And I think often in this discourse, we frequently focus on the bottom part of races to the bottom, right? These are the disasters that might await us and the prisoner's dilemma that lead to terrible global outcomes. And I think that's natural because I think it's easy and somewhat fun to think about dystopian scenarios. But I want to take a few minutes to consider the question of whether or not it is, in fact, a race at all. I was actually joking with a friend before I jumped on the line. I was like, just what kind of race is the AI race? Is it a foot race, like a 5K? Or is it a relay race, right? I mean, if anything, I think it's a kind of three-legged race, really, if you take a look at it. And I think the fundamental problem I have with the race frame, right, the idea of that this competition can be conceptualized this way, is that it really assumes that all of the players have the same object in mind, right? When you are racing towards something, there's ideally some objective that you're all chasing after. And again, I think this is part of the problem of thinking about an, quote, sort of AI arms race, right? Because the more you dig into it, the more it becomes clear that it's frequently not about AI. It's frequently not about arms, right? Not about munitions. And it's frequently not a race, right? I think as Will mentions, a lot of these so-called races are in fact kind of sort of pat terms to refer to all sorts of types of competition happening at many, many different levels. And I think we would be better suited, I think, considering each of these kind of smaller bits of competition in detail, right, with all the context that implies, rather than trying to conceptualize it as this grand concept, right? We are in this AI arms race. So you might be saying, okay, Tim, I buy that argument then. So if you're so smart, what is your proposal? And I think we do really need more sophisticated mental models for conceptualizing AI competition. And I think the thing that I've been experimenting most with and thinking through is really the idea of thinking about competition in AI, not necessarily as a race, but really over a competition over what you might call sort of utilization capacity. So if it is a kind of race, right, if we want to conceptualize it as something that we're familiar with by means of metaphor, it's really a kind of eating contest, right? We're asking the question, out of all of the players that are, competing over AI, who has the organizational, monetary, cultural, technical ability to utilize these breakthroughs that are happening in an academic field? And who can do that faster than everybody else? And this might sound a little bit abstract, but I think it's really not. I think it really demands a kind of socio-technical analysis that requires you to hold two things in your head at the same time. The first one is to think about the social factors that allow you to utilize machine learning more or less effectively. And then the second thing you have to hold in your mind is actually the technical specifics of the field itself, right? What is possible given the state of the research and the technology as we know it? And I think this approach is really useful, and it's something that I benefited a lot from. There's a paper I just did for CSEC called Shaping the Terrain of AI Competition, which really kind of thinks about this in the context of competition between sort of autocratic societies and autocratic regimes versus more sort of liberal democratic societies, right? And to give you a sense of how this kind of analysis plays out, I'll give you one example. Basically, I'm taking a look first at the question of data utilization, right? Which is that we know that training AI systems in the typical sort of supervised learning sense basically requires that you collect lots of data, right? And one way of viewing that is to say, well, certain types of actors have lower cost ways of accessing data than others. And the fact that you have a lower cost access to data really allows you to utilize the technology more effectively than someone that doesn't. Right. And that kind of analysis allows you to kind of make conjectures along the lines of, well, do privacy laws, right, restrict our ability to, as a society, to leverage AI in certain types of domains. And I think that's sort of indisputable in some ways. But I think this analysis is useful because it allows you to combine sort of both the kind of specifics that are happening, right, the latest papers that are appearing on arXiv, and use them to make strategic conjectures about the types of actors, the type of nations, companies, individuals that will sort of win in competitions around AI. And I think there's two responses to that, right? And maybe this will be sort of a provocation for the discussion. I think one approach, especially on this privacy question, right, is to merely say, well, we will flex our sort of culture and our laws and our organizations to fit the needs of AI, right? The one way to win on AI is simply to lower our costs of acquiring data until we could do it just as good as someone who doesn't have those restrictions. And I think the other one, though, which I think is intriguing and I think is a route that you often don't hear about, particularly in policy circles, is the notion that there might be a way not to have to compromise sort of strongly held sort of cultural values in an effort to win competitions. And one way of doing that is through technical research. Like, what are the technical problems that we can crack that don't require a society to choose between, say, commitments to privacy and effective use of AI? And I do think that opens up a kind of line of discussion here about how malleable AI itself is and how choices made in research agendas can actually create these much larger sort of influential impacts on the broader strategic environment in which AI competition is occurring. So let me just pause there. I don't want to leave as much time for questions as possible, but maybe just a few ideas to get us started.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'm definitely going to carry that image of the eating contest with me after this conversation.
You're welcome, I guess.
So I'll invite all of our panelists to come back on video, and we're going to move to Q&A. And thank you to everybody who has already put some questions in the Q&A box. And please feel free to continue to do that as we have the conversation, and also feel free to upvote the questions that others have submitted. But to start us off, I'm going to actually pick up on something that you said, Tim, and that one of our audience members has asked. So Tim, you've just talked about technical research as a lever for creating more of a race to the top, or I don't know, a slower eating contest. I'm not quite sure how that analogy goes. In industries where a race to the bottom seems likely. And I think to get started, Will and Elsa, would love to hear from you both. What levers do you see in addition to technical research that Tim mentioned?
I'm happy to jump in quickly. Yeah, other levers. I think that the aviation case at the very least suggests that regulation, empowering regulators to actually, step in and govern a little bit more is not always such a bad thing. And maybe especially, I think the aviation case points to the importance of regulators cooperating across countries. So anything that we can do to sort of increase the bandwidth of cross-country and regulatory collaboration, that feels like a fertile territory for us to explore more.
Yeah, so I tend to concur in the theme of cross-country engagement and collaboration on these issues. I would also add that I think greater education and awareness of the risks to moderate some of the intense enthusiasm about AI, I think is warranted and is quite constructive. Somebody who is trying without much of a technical background to begin with to improve my currently very poor capacity to implement any of this in my own research, a greater awareness of just how difficult and finicky the process can be, for lack of a better word, I think does give you a greater awareness of the limitations. And I think it's been encouraging to see, for instance, in some of the earliest writings from Chinese military strategists, there was this very exuberant sense that AI would change everything. And that certainly was a narrative also that would arise in US national security conversations. And to some degree, there was a mirroring between the two of sort of a general global, I think, craze or hype cycle around AI that certainly wasn't just in the realm of national security. I think certainly the headlines, a lot of the conversations with the industry as well, especially those that are less technical in some cases, do frame AI as hyper powerful, and sort of artificial general intelligence is on the verge of being realized any day now. And I think, yeah, I think that as there's been more awareness and as well as greater degrees of nuance in these conversations, there has been more attention to these safety and security challenges, to the risks that come into play. And I think simply ensuring that policymakers and decision makers at different levels and organizations have greater awareness and at least a baseline of education and understanding on these risks is critical, so that the folks who do have that technical proficiency and the engineers who are responsible for implementing are able to pursue best practices without having pressures politically or otherwise or commercially that could result in compromises on safety and security. So I think trying to bring different elements of expertise together in the conversation and ensuring that a reasonable understanding of risk can outweigh some of the initial expectations is important. Hopefully things are trending positively in that direction generally.
Yeah, and I do think, if I can jump in, I do think there is actually a really fascinating research question here, which is whether or not we think the lever of regulation and the lever of law is going to become stronger or weaker with time with regards to kind of shaping the deployment and social impact of AI. So I think a little bit about the fact that, like, imagine a world in which most AI applications are things that you can run locally, at the endpoints of the network, right, on your laptop, on a computer. Suddenly it becomes very difficult to use law as a way of kind of controlling access to the tech. But if we end up having a deployment sort of landscape where most of the important sort of machine learning in the world is done through, these clouds that are done in these sort of big data centers that are very hard to move around, suddenly there's kind of a point of control that's a little bit more enforceable to build laws and regulations around. And so I do think that there is actually this really interesting relationship, I think, between how the technology will be rolled out and how it will be used, and like which levers will actually be sort of available and will actually make a difference, right, in where the technology goes.
Yep. That's great. Thanks all of you for that. I'm gonna move on to another question that's gotten a few votes. Some folks in the audience are interested in, I think, digging in a little bit more to the Boeing case. Someone asks, it seems that despite pressure for greater safety, Boeing did in fact compromise safety in the pursuit of profit in the 737 MAX case, at least for a period of time. So kind of what can you guys comment on, should we be more worried about AI races to the bottom in the aftermath of kind of that signal of the Boeing incident? Or is there something else at play there? So maybe, Will, I'll let you field that first, but would also love to hear what Elsa and Tim have to say about it.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one that I definitely thought about in writing the paper. The way that I interpret this case is that absolutely Boeing was sort of compromising and pushing back on the constraints that were set up by regulators. And in this case, I wouldn't say that they managed to get away with it. So I viewed this as a pretty clear rebuke of Boeing's practices. And I think that I expect to see Boeing take that very seriously in the years ahead. I think that the question you ask about whether other industries will have this kind of early signal is a really important question. So in the case of aviation, you do get these really clear signals in the form of a single plane crashing, and that is a huge tragedy, but it's a finite number of people who can be hurt by that. If you have AI being used in, say, a nuclear weapon system, which I do not think is on the table at the moment, but if hypothetically that were to happen, then the number of people who could be harmed by an accident is much less. It has a much higher upper bound on how much damage that could do. So I think that those kinds of cases where you maybe wouldn't get an early warning are actually a really, really good place to look if you're looking for worst case scenarios.
Great. Elsa or Tim want to jump in on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I do think that the sort of aviation case is interesting, and it should also be read alongside, I think, the nuclear case in some ways. One of the things I think is interesting, particularly in the world of, is there a race to the top or a race to the bottom, is that so much of it, I think, particularly in sort of a democratic society, right, depends on the sort of psychology around like sort of the public perception of the technology, right? And those are not always sort of like, rational is the wrong word, but I think they're not always based in sort of a holistic, technically informed view of the technology, right? And so that I really do believe, as in the nuclear case, right, that like specific incidents can taint the use of the technology in other types of domains. And I am kind of watching for that in the AI case, right? Which is there some really big disaster with autonomous vehicles that ends up tainting sort of the reputation of machine learning in all sorts of other applications, right? And I do think I am looking for that, right? What is a disaster that we might envision that might actually foreclose opportunities in the technology elsewhere? Because I do think that sort of like public perception of the technology isn't so nuanced as to be along the lines of, well, this is a computer vision system and computer vision systems have these failures, right? I think it more tends to be along the lines of AI has these systematic problems and no application will be safe because of this one example that we have. And so I do think that we should be alert to kind of these early sort of disasters potentially setting sort of regulation in a certain direction.
Great. Well, that's really interesting, and I'm going to keep us moving because our audience has a lot of questions. And these are great questions that I'm seeing coming through the chat. But I'm going to switch gears a little. Someone has asked kind of on the question of cooperating on AI safety and trustworthiness. What are the tensions when you get into antitrust issues? So, for example, cooperating without entering anti-competitive agreements, and what effect that has on more scrutiny of dominant players. And this person asks, including limiting further acquisitions. So I don't know if you folks have perspective on that question, but would love to hear what your research has shown.
I'm happy to take an initial cut at the question. So at least in the antitrust context, right, you really need sort of two elements to make out an antitrust claim, right? The first piece is that you have market dominance. And the second one is that you are engaging in anti-competitive conduct, right? And I think the question, almost checks the box already on that second factor. Let's say they're making an agreement that's colorably anti-competitive. I think the question then all ultimately comes down to market definition, right? Are these two companies working together to cooperate in a way that's anti-competitive in a market that they're in? So interestingly, I think what that means is that it's very difficult to define a generalized market for AI. And so typically, I think what will occur in the antitrust case will be, the things that will be most suspect, interestingly, will be agreements to cooperate, but in an industry where there's already a couple of really big dominant players. And so I guess ironically, I'm just thinking through this on the fly, the ones that are perhaps most risky for companies to engage in are sort of intra-industry arrangements, whereas actually the place might be clear on sort of inter-industry arrangements, which I guess, again, some research would have to be done to see whether or not that incentivizes more cross-industry collaboration on these issues. But that would be my completely rough sort of 2 cents on the issue.
And to take a stab at the question from the angle of geopolitical considerations, we'd hope to see robust and continuing collaboration between the US and China and the international research ecosystem in general on issues of AI safety and security, including as pertain to systems that might be in sensitive use cases, but some of the constraints there could be could emerge from the way in which this research is regarded and how the incentives are perceived as well. So for instance, there's been some discussion, including by Chinese military experts, on the notion of counter AI capabilities of disrupting or subverting an enemy's AI systems. And from that perspective, the incentives are to identify vulnerabilities and techniques for their exploitation and not to share that knowledge or not to contribute to general solutions that can be applied. And similarly, yeah, the incentives for any military that regards another as in terms of an adversarial interaction might be to focus on subversion rather than security. And then the question then becomes, are there conditions under which cooperation on best practices or measures to mitigate security concerns could be sustainable and could not be viewed as too sensitive from a security perspective, or could not be disrupted by the fears of disadvantaging oneself or one side. And I hope that there are ways to ensure that this research in general remains open enough, such as it is, and that the exchange of best practices can be generalizable enough, and so as not to touch upon that sensitivity. I think much of that is happening already in industry and academia. Hopefully there are ways to promote and contribute to the sustainment of that kind of technical engagement. But I think there are certain tensions that may come into play, and I think reasons to try to look for ways whenever possible to reframe this as having an AI system that is unsafe, that is risky, that could create a dangerous situation, whether in a given industry or in a geopolitical flashpoint, could be risky for everyone. And whether we're thinking about the concerns about unintended escalation due to an accident, or the perceptual factor, as Tim had mentioned, that if AI is seen as less safe or risky, or if there's a turn in public perception against it, that'll be mutually damaging for even players that may regard each other as competitive. So I think this is a case where the question of framing and perception of what and interpretation of incentives may shape the dynamics going forward as well.
That's great. Super interesting. Okay, I am going to move us to a next question. And this one has a little bit more to do in all of your research. Have you seen different dynamics in the commercial versus the defense or the military domains? So are there places where the defense or military establishment can move faster, or places where commercial manufacturers can move faster? And kind of, are you seeing a clear kind of line between the kind of race or the kind of eating contest that it is in commercial versus defense or military applications?
Sure, I can jump in on that. At least from my kind of like armchair point of view, having talked to some folks who are working on this in the defense space, it does seem like part of the problem in the defense universe is, to use the eating contest metaphor, is that the defense establishment's metabolism is very slow. It's like very hard for them to eat new technologies and then actually incorporate them into their operations. And so there's been a tendency to try to go to technologies that are sort of as kind of commodified or as reliable as possible, right? So you think about like a lot of the work has been like, can we use standard computer vision stuff to just solve as basic of a problem as possible? Because I think part of the battle is not just the kind of inevitable procurement issues that crop up in the defense space, but the other one is also just like convincing people that this is a technology that will provide value to them. And so there has been a struggle even to kind of like sell the value of the technology, you know, to folks who are really will need to confront problems on the day-to-day level. And so I guess in some ways the adoption strategy has been different in some ways in the defense space versus what I more characterize in the commercial space, which is let's show you some whiz-bang technology and get everybody super excited by it. I think people who are doing the serious work in the defense space are trying to keep their claims, you know, as tied to kind of the everyday as possible in an effort to get adoption.
I would add that generally speaking, the various applications that arise in the context of defense are more challenging. In some cases, some of the most difficult use cases based on scenarios for which there won't be data readily available. So beyond the general difficulties of military organizations in terms of adoption capacity and even questions of management of data, having the fundamental infrastructure underlying in order, having a strategy and approach to retain and recruit talent who can be in charge of deployment and implementation. There's also the difficulty of trying to develop AI systems and applications for scenarios where the stakes are much higher. And I think in some respects, the defense world, broadly construed, may be more conservative or more cautious in a sense, given that the risks or potential consequences from an accident may be graver, and there often are relatively strict or established procedures in place for testing and verification prior to actual deployment. So in some respects, I'm more concerned about industry on that front, and I think these factors are another reason why the notion of an arms race is, at the very best, terribly misleading, given that there are incentives for professional organizations such as militaries that have these procedures and a culture focused on safety and testing in place, whereas more nascent startups that have different kinds of commercial considerations, or as we've seen, corporations with a profit incentive may have lesser regard for safety and resilience in terms of questions of verification.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Will, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or should we keep moving?
I guess I could say briefly, yeah, I didn't look in my paper, at least, at the military side, basically at all, but I think it's a fascinating question. And it seems pretty plausible to me that you might again see multiple different races happening in multiple different parts of the defense industry, or not races, but just different competitive dynamics. And I think that would in itself be sort of very exciting to explore the whole range of different trajectories there.
Great. Well, I'm going to move to a closing question. This time has flown by. And for people in the audience, if we didn't get to your question, apologies. We will put up contact info for all of our panelists at the end of the session. So do reach out with further questions. But in closing, for all of you, more of a big picture question. You know, you guys have all written in various ways about the upside of trustworthy AI and AI safety. So if you look, 5 years into the future, what are you most concerned about with AI development, and what makes you most hopeful? And I will just go around in the order that we did the presentation. So starting with you, Will.
Okay, I guess, yeah, my response to that is, I can't help but think of GPT-3, which probably many people in the audience know about, the very large language model that OpenAI released earlier this year. And I think that the thing that GPT-3 has done is show, just how useful it can be to plow huge amounts of, petaflops potentially of compute into these AI systems to get more and more general capabilities. And I'm both very excited to see where that goes over the next few years as companies start to see the kind of profit motive for pushing generality further. And I'm also pretty worried about what might happen as they start to do that. Yeah.
Thanks, Will. Elsa, final closing reflections.
Let's see, I suppose I'd say to start, I'm similarly concerned about the ways in which AI systems can be used to enhance censorship, to enable propaganda for purposes of surveillance, in terms of the implications for human rights and the future of democratic governance at a moment when we are seeing human rights under threat at home and on the world stage, and certainly when it comes to the Chinese government's preferred applications of these technologies in ways in which their understanding of AI security is inextricable from thinking about public security and social stability, which often manifest in ways that are horrifically coercive, as for instance, we've seen with the atrocities in Xinjiang. So I think although these aren't strictly technical factors and considerations, it does raise some pretty troubling implications about where the field is going, the potential of these technologies, and the risks and benefits of engagement, given some of the ethical concerns and in play and at stake at this moment. And I guess beyond that, I'm also concerned about the general trajectory of U.S.-China relations and whether we can find more options for communication, engagement, to crisis response and management going forward. And I guess that's all concerned. So I guess as a final attempt to regain some optimism, I think that, yeah, I'm encouraged by the expertise, by the insights of folks who are on the front lines of working on trying to solve these issues from a very practical perspective. And I hope that that we'll continue to see progress in technical solutions, even when political profit motives or geopolitical considerations may be an impediment or complication.
Thanks, Elsa. As I said before, I'm encouraged by what encourages you. And Tim, any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Sure. I guess on things I'm optimistic about, I do think that genuinely there are a lot of interesting sort of subfields of machine learning research right now that have the ability to sort of deeply reshape where AI is going in a really good direction, right? That's everything from the fairness work to stuff like, I think, one-shot learning, right? Like the idea that like you can train systems with considerably less data than we're used to, right? And so I do think the technology will continue to advance, and there are some opportunities to kind of like have that technical research actually reshape the strategic environment in a really important way. I suppose the thing I'm sort of most kind of pessimistic about is that I guess I worry a little bit that our sort of national strategies around AI will never sort of achieve the level of nuance that's actually required to deal with some of these problems, right? I think you do see a lot of national strategies along the lines of, we just need to throw more money at it, so we'll have the bigger and the better AI. And I do think that tends to lead to both a lot of wasted resources, but also might not necessarily provide the kind of competitive edge that you hope that the United States might want to have over the next decade in this technology. And so I do worry a little bit about that.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you. This has really been an insightful and provocative conversation, and we're so glad that you could join us and share your reflections and your work. And we're just at the top of the hour, so I am going to say farewell to everybody, and thank you to our audience for coming and for asking such great questions. And I will hand it back over to Rachel.
All right, thanks so much, Anne. And yes, a big thank you once again to Will, Tim, and Elsa. It's a fantastic discussion, a lot to fit into 1 hour. So thank you all for sharing with us. And of course, huge thank you to the audience. I know we're a minute or two over now, but we appreciate you hanging in, tuning in and asking questions today. And we hope you'll stay in touch. So if you'd like to reach out to CLTC or any of the panelists, you can find them at their respective handles and websites listed here. And of course, we'd also like to thank our CLTC partners who help support our mission and help us to get this important work and research out into the world. I am going to throw in to the chat a link to the CLTC events website, where we have a couple of upcoming events that may be of interest to this audience, particularly our research exchange series. The second event on November 12th will be focused on protecting and securing a more inclusive society online. And then on December 10th, our final research exchange event will feature a series of research talks about the long-term security implications of AI and ML systems. So hopefully we'll see a lot of you at that event as well. In the meantime, hope that you all stay as happy and healthy as is possible during these turbulent times. Hang in there. And thanks again so much for joining us. Take care. Bye for now.